There being 232 votes in the affirmative, 180 votes in the negative, the District of Columbia Statehood Bill, H.R. 51, is passed without objection. Motion to reconsider is laid upon the table.
Should the District of Columbia become the 51st state? While the majority of Americans do agree that D.C. should not become a state, the reasons why are varied. So let's go ahead and break this down because, again, this is another one of those classic situations where there is an actual understandable and even reasonable idea of why the residents of Washington, D.C. would like to be a state and how the Democrats are using that, feeding that to give them what they want, but not for the reasons that they want it. Let me explain. The framers of our Constitution, the founders of our government, decided that the capital where our government would be headquartered, would reside, would not be under any state control. And the reasons for that, I think, are fairly obvious. Imagine now if Washington, D.C. became a state on its own. It's obviously going to become a democratic state. There's no argument about that. It would be a blue state. It would have Democratic senators, Democratic congresspeople. It would have a Democratic governor. The mayor of D.C. would, by de facto, become the governor. And so we certainly understand what the governmental structure of this 51st state would be. Now imagine you have a Republican in the White House. Imagine the conflict that's going to happen when the president wants to do something in Washington, D.C., that the governor steps in and says, no, I have a mandate. You can't do that here. You're going to set up an incredible situation where one party is going to be at a gross disadvantage when they occupy the White House, and what the political payback would be by the new 51st state. I think everybody on both sides of the aisle sees that as a problem. We certainly acknowledge that the Democrats, and that's why they're using and feeding this frenzy, they want D.C. to become a 51st state because it gives them 2 more senators, and they believe that's the way that they keep a lock on the United States Senate. Now, the residents of D.C., they want statehood for a simple reason, and if you look at their license plates, they have it emblazoned as a motto: taxation without representation. See, the District of Columbia, they get taxed, and taxed heavily, to do a lot of the things that are in line with the protection of the governmental structure. Washington, D.C., the federal government, and Capitol Hill, they are financially responsible for the tax base that takes care of things that go on for our nation's capital. And they don't have anyone in government, they don't have a voice in government saying, hey, whoa, wait a minute, and at least one vote to say, no, we don't want that tax increase here. If we understand the founding of our country was built around that simple taxation without representation. That was what led to the actual founding of America. So it's an understandable and even reasonable request that the residents of D.C. have. Here is the issue. Constitutionally, they can't do it without an amendment to the Constitution. See, the House simply passing a measure that gets kicked over to the Senate, and even if the Senate approves it and the president signs off on it, not so fast. According to the Constitution, the District of Columbia, the home, the headquarters for the federal government, is to remain neutral. And so, because that's what the Constitution says, if you're going to bring D.C. in as a state, you would have to actually amend the Constitution, which means you would require this vote to go out to the states to vote on, which means we, the people, would actually get a say should D.C. become a state or not. Now, I realize there are other territories that have been welcomed in as states that did not require a constitutional amendment, and that's what the proponents of the D.C. bill keep talking about. Hey, we brought Hawaii in. We didn't need an amendment to the Constitution to do that. We brought Alaska in. We didn't need an amendment to the Constitution to do that. Well, those areas are not designated by the Constitution as neutral areas as being the home and the seat of our government. So because they want to now bring D.C. in as a state, it would require a constitutional amendment. Senator Joe Manchin, Democrat from West Virginia, kind of threw a monkey wrench into the works over the weekend when he said he does not support D.C. becoming a state. Bum, ba-dum, bum. And with the filibuster still in place in the Senate, it would require 60 votes to pass. Well, if you already have one Democrat defecting, and I got a feeling a couple more might defect as well, and if the Republicans hold the line and say, absolutely not, D.C. does not become a state, then this thing is dead in the water. So there is no doubt pressure being put on Manchin by the Democrats to try to change his vote, and we shall see if Manchin is a typical rhino Republican, that if he gets the right thing, he'll cave, or if he's actually a man of principle, and even though I don't agree with why he stays a member of the Democratic Party, I do respect anybody that stands by a principle, even if it's one I might personally disagree with. If they stand by the principle, if they are for sale to the highest bidder, like some of the so-called conservatives are, well, then, zero respect. That said, a proposal was then suggested that I believe it's a 10-mile perimeter around Capitol Hill be designated as the neutral zone, and that would stay under the control of the President of the United States. Actually holds the authority over Washington, D.C. And during the January 6th so-called riots, the mayor of D.C. wanted, again, that push for D.C. being the 51st state because the mayor / then governor would be able to order in the National Guard to, quote unquote, stop the riot. Okay. And that was one of the issues that was fueled during January the 6th. Now, again, we all know how that could work against a sitting president if a governor of the seat of our government has authority basically over the president, over the Congress. Talk about an imbalance. Talk about the tail wagging the dog. All kinds of nightmare scenarios can be created by that. So the Democrats' compromise was to say that for a radius immediately around Capitol Hill, the White House, etc., that would remain under federal control. Okay, then D.C. still doesn't need to become a state. Because if you're going to set the rest of the city then apart, well, let it be adopted by Maryland or Virginia. But see, the Democrats really aren't interested in the residents of Washington, D.C. having, quote, representation for their taxation. The Democrats just want 2 more Democratic senators and more Democratic congressmen. So they're not going to allow D.C. to be adopted by Maryland or Virginia. And that would solve the problem, would let the residents of D.C. feel like they had an actual voice in government over what they're being taxed. And it would not expand the number of senators. We wouldn't have to have 52 senators. The senators from either Virginia or Maryland would then represent the city of Washington. And again, I've already talked about the absurdity of this. What happens if we decide, you know what, Chicago needs to be its own state? Los Angeles ought to be its own state. San Francisco ought to be its own state. New York City ought to be its own state. I mean, this is ridiculous. You want to keep a designated area around the Capitol as neutral as the Constitution calls for? I think you are on strong constitutional grounds to do that. If you want to declare that part of the city does not fall under that jurisdiction and thus can be adopted by a state, again, I believe you are on strong constitutional footing to do that. To just simply Congress pass and the Senate pass and the president sign off on, ta-da, by magic proxy, D.C. is now a state. That is not constitutional, and it is completely problematic. Hey, thanks for watching today's rant. Make sure you give us a thumbs up and a like. Share this to your social media platforms. They're killing our algorithm again. Once again, I'm losing subscribers, so please check your subscription. Make sure you're still subscribed. Smack the bell, click the word all to get notification of my next rant. I know some of you are having trouble finding us on Rumble. It's rumble.com/Pastor Marty. You won't find me in the search engine or Google that way. It's rumble.com/Pastor Marty. Please look below. You will see a direct link that takes you right to my channel.